Welcome to the Push-Pull Podcast, where we interview professionals about their career transitions, specifically the push and pull factors that informed their transitions. On today's episode, you're going to hear the first part of my conversation with Omar Dinar. He is a financial advisor at Merrill Lynch. Omar is actually somebody that I met through Lunch Club, lunchclub.com. It's a networking platform. We kind of hit it off right away. I really respected his wisdom and energy, and he was super kind enough to do me the favor of being on my podcast. He started off his career as an engineer doing manufacturing for military contractors, working on Black Hawk helicopters, which is insanely cool, and ended up pivoting over into financial services, where he basically graduates into the post-subprime mortgage crisis economy. His first job right out of his MBA was working at Lehman Brothers. I asked him to go over some of the macro picture and how that actually impacted his work in risk management. Our conversation was phenomenal, but unfortunately, we ended up having some technical difficulties for the latter half of that conversation. So Omar has actually been incredibly generous with his time, and we're planning to re-record some of that stuff. But in the meantime, I did want to share some of the early parts of his career, which, quite frankly, are incredibly interesting on their own. How did he go from manufacturing over into financial services? What were the things that he was thinking about at the time? What were the factors of the military contractor company that did not quite give him the sense of fulfillment that he wanted? A lot of that had to do with his ambitions and being maybe mismatched with the pace or structure of advancement at that company. And then, taking a bet on himself to go into finance and ending up there at quite possibly the worst time to ever be at a company like Lehman Brothers. I was really impressed with how he continued to just keep his head down and committing to his vision for himself and for his career in the midst of all of this turmoil. It was also really interesting to learn about how the world and the macro environment ended up impacting the trajectory of his career. If it wasn't for the financial crisis, I don't think he would be thinking about being in risk management. But because there was this entire regulatory effort that came in and changed financial services, he ended up in this part of the industry that was rapidly growing, which is essentially risk management, regulatory compliance, all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, we are ending this conversation towards the very end of the entire subprime mortgage crisis and what that meant for where he ended up landing at Barclays after they acquired Lehman Brothers. But then we see his career progression and the pivots and moving from one place to another. One of the things that we're going to be diving into again, the second time we record, is to really try to understand how the relationship building aspect of management informed so much of his career and really also informed the likes and dislikes. And he found the ways to do the things that he did like more over time. And so we'll revisit that part of the conversation in the next part of the episode. So huge thanks to Omar, not only for sitting with me through an entire interview, but also being willing to do another part to share with you all of his insights. He's incredibly wise. So super excited to have somebody from financial services on, and really hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, we're here with Omar Dinar, who is a wealth management advisor at Merrill Lynch. Thanks for being on with us, Omar.
Thank you for having me. My name's Omar Dinar. I'm the wealth management advisor at Merrill. I feel like this is the third leg of my career, and hopefully the final leg, something I really am passionate about and enjoy to do for the next 25 years. But I'm happy to talk about my journey, starting off as an engineer in the aerospace industry, navigating my way into finance and what I call the worst possible place and time, and then how I came to be at my current role.
Let's go all the way back. If I were to ask you about where you started your career, how would you answer that question? Would you start with your undergraduate experience? What were the kinds of things that you were looking to do? What were your motivations at the time? Paint a picture for us of what the beginning of Omar's career was like.
All right, sounds good. I was an engineering student at the University of Connecticut a long time ago. I had the opportunity to do a couple of internships at a local aerospace company that they manufacture helicopters here in Connecticut, named as Sikorsky Aircraft.
Okay.
So they make the Black Hawk helicopter, the President's helicopters. Those are probably the two most public ones. I did 2 summer internships there. I made some really great connections, and ended up getting hired there after I graduated, a couple months after I graduated from college. So I was very fortunate. Had an amazing first manager, one of the best I've had in my career, and somebody who left a very long lasting impact on me. And that started off my career first as a manufacturing engineer and a tool designer. My job was that my first job out of school was, I like to say, I was crawling through half-built helicopters, looking at different processes and figuring out how to improve them from a efficiency, quality, safety standpoint, or all of the above.
What was the kind of engineering that you were studying in school? And did you think that the first job out of college was going to be one where you were crawling around helicopters and improving processes for that kind of thing?
The program, I would say, it was really new at the time. It was a joint program between the engineering and business school. So I would say it was a combination of a management degree and like industrial engineering, let's call it. So it was very much around operations and process focused. And so I knew that I was geared towards moving into manufacturing. Just which manufacturing, I didn't know. There's a couple large manufacturers here in Connecticut, one of which not far from where I grew up is helicopter manufacturer. And I just ended up being really fortunate that it ended up working out that way, that I was able to get a job there.
That's awesome. And you mentioned the relationship that you had with your manager being incredibly valuable. Was this the same person that was managing you during your, did you say it was an internship while you were still in school before you came on full time? Was it the same people that you were working with? How did that kind of work out in terms of the relationships that you built there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did 2 internships. So one my junior and senior years in between, and they were at actually different locations. My first summer, I was it was a repair facility nearby for transmissions and rotor heads. So those components would come in from the field after so many flight hours, they have to get serviced. And so I was working there. And then the following summer was actually their helicopter blade repair facility. So same thing, after so many hours of points of service, they have to get it and get repaired. Or sometimes they end up in situations where they come back because they've been damaged and they have bullet holes in them. So that was the repair facility. Now the internship had a number of people who were associated with it, one of which turned out to be my manager. So weren't necessarily reporting into him, but he helped manage that internship he was a component, one of the people involved with that internship program. So I got to know him fairly well during my 2 summer internships.
And that was the person that ended up becoming your manager when you
Yeah.
joined full time.
Yep, exactly.
What was it about that relationship that was so valuable? And what was it about that caused you to look back on it so fondly?
He's a very approachable manager. He always had the time to listen, and he would try to find ways to bring out the best in the people he worked with, excuse me. And I think that he was just very extremely knowledgeable, but very humble. And I learned a lot of lessons from him. And later on in my career, when I first became a manager in a different role, I tried to emulate him. He was who I was trying to, because I had such a positive experience. So if I used a lot of how he approached management, I took a lot of that when I became a manager.
I would love to talk more about that when we get to that point
Sure.
of you becoming a manager as well. And I think it's really cool, especially because you've obviously made transitions from that industry. And it sounds like a lot of those things that you probably leaned on as a manager still applied.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even now in the job I'm in, even though I don't have direct reports, I feel like a lot of the skills I use in managing my clients are there's a lot of interchangeable skills between managing your people that report to you and managing your clients, because you're managing the relationship and you're trying to get them, convince them or motivate them to do something that you want them to do. And so I found that when I moved into this role, which I had never had any sales experience prior, I ended up leaning heavily on my managerial skills in order to win business and to manage my clients' relationships.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about just pros and cons about where you were at the time in the manufacturing engineering role. What were the things that you were thinking about at the time, and how did that inform you eventually making a decision to move out? I know when you and I talked, I think you had spoken about going to school
Yep.
while you were working as well. Paint a picture a little bit about like what you were experiencing during your time there and how that potentially informed what your ambitions were for what came next.
Yeah, absolutely. The first pro is what you had touched on. The company at the time had one of the most amazing education programs for their employees. I was extremely fortunate at that time where an employee they would pay 100% of any degree an employee wanted, bachelor's, master's, PhD, whether it was related to your role or not. At the time, that company publicly said they wanted the most educated workforce, and they were. My manager had 2 master's degrees. His manager had 3. I knew people with multiple PhDs that were all just funded through the company. So the moment I joined in early '03, I immediately looked at all the different master's programs within a reasonable distance of where I lived and worked and thought about I need to take advantage of this. And oddly enough, I ended up settling in on a master's degree in finance at the end of the day. And my initial thought was, well, having a bit of a quantitative background as an engineer, maybe finance could be a good complement. And that could be something maybe interesting for me to pivot to in my career. And if that wasn't the case, I get to learn a lot about investments in this new area that could potentially help me personally as well. And then on the con side, one thing that really stood out was, as much as I enjoyed my time there, was I felt there wasn't a lot of internal movement in the firm. When I was an engineer, a lot of people were there in the same role for 10, 20, 30 years. And so it tended to be very much, you had a lot of job security, but you tended to stay in a role for a very long amount of time. And also it was maybe because it was a military contractor, there was very much a level around length of service being such a huge factor in your ability to advance in your career versus your own personal ambition and drive, having that be more of a motivating factor. It seemed like it was just a very slow process. And as a result of that, just people that I just felt like that I wasn't around, the environment just didn't have as much drive because of that. And that was definitely a factor. That was one of the factors on why I ended up wanting to move elsewhere eventually.
Yeah. And so it sounds like it wasn't just this particular organization that you were with, but you saw maybe some of that being a trend of the kind of company that it was, being a military contractor. Did you feel like, I guess one of the questions I had was like, did you ever get a chance to talk to other people that were working at similar companies, doing similar things, and get a sense of what the cultures were like there? And if that same sense of maybe things are moving a little bit more slowly, or I don't know if that's the way that you would have categorized it. I think one of the things that you said is not as much drive. I'd be curious to know if the organization that you were with was unique in that way, or if there was something more as a through line in the industry.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's difficult to say for certain. There were some opportunities where I was at events or I had to travel and I met people from competing companies. And there could be some cultural similarities with some of those firms. I can't say for sure, but it seems like it would be surprising if there was if people were having similar experiences at those competing firms. Yeah, it's certainly possible.
And so at this point, the company that you're working at has this incredible education reimbursement program, something that you really are drawn to. There's this kind of like push factor of, I don't know if this is necessarily the industry for me, because as much as I love the day-to-day of what I'm doing, advancement doesn't quite work the same way as my ambition would drive me forwards towards pursuing. So that's a push factor, whereas the pull factor is, I'm interested in finance. I have a quant background. I think I could like use these skills to my benefit, either professionally or personally. And so that's what you ended up studying and gravitating towards. Is that a fair summary of push and pull?
I think that's a great way to summarize it. Absolutely, Varun. And Bertie, there was actually a second role I ended up landing in about around the time I was finishing my master's degree at Sikorsky. And it was really interesting by complete like circumstance. Kind of funny how it ended up initially starting. So my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, was still in college. and she was waitressing in the evenings. And one of her colleagues at the restaurant that she was starting to become really good friends with, turned out that her husband was also working at the same company. And she's, oh, great. He actually worked in a finance department. And he's, oh, well, my boyfriend just finished his master's degree in finance and he works at that same company. And he says, I'll talk to my husband and maybe we can get them to meet. That would be so cool. And he wanted to meet me. And it turned out he was a very senior executive, probably a direct report into the CFO. So he was running a fairly large division within finance at this firm. I wanted to meet me, which really ended up working out. So we scheduled a meeting with him and went to his office, and really I was blown away. He was also a fantastic manager, but he was so different in other aspects. I called him, he could have been a politician. He was just such a great talker and he could just sell things so well. And by the end of that meeting, he had convinced me that I should go work for him. There were 2 layers of management between where I worked to where he was. So he was fairly senior, but I ended up taking a job and working for one of his teams. It was more of a project management role. So it was interesting that I was working still a lot it was a research and development project to build one of the new products and one of the new helicopters. And so I was still working a lot with engineering and with all other aspects. And it gave me a very unique view of the company that I hadn't seen before. Previously, my world was that process that I was focused on and improving. And now I took a step back and all of a sudden I was able to see all the different types of engineering that goes into the helicopter. I was able to see the budgeting side, the scheduling side, the interaction with the military throughout the process. That was fascinating. So I ended up doing that for the first 2 years of my career. I was doing this engineering work. And then the next 2 years of my career, I was in this finance/project management role at the firm.
That's so cool. So you ended up staying at the same company as you were like looking to make an exit. This kind of kismet energy comes into your life and you meet somebody else that seems to have maybe played another kind of like maybe mentorship role in your career at that point, but convinced you to stay at the company in a completely new role. Did it feel like it scratched a little bit of the itch that you maybe had when you were in the more kind of like engineering manufacturing role to move on and do different things?
Yeah, it did. It gave me an opportunity. I was able to get a promotion through that, which was a little bit accelerated than the norm at the company. It gave me the opportunity. He put me in a very visible project and something that he gave me the opportunity to do, to present updates directly to the CFO, to the chief financial officer. So he gave me an opportunity really to shine and to have me be very to build up more, to understand the company and he really did a great job challenging me. So that did help. That did help. I still had the itch though. I was in my mid-20s. Being in my mid-20s, I wanted to move into the big city. I still had my thoughts. Eventually I want to get to New York. I want to do this job in one of the big financial hubs in the world. And so that was still on the back of my mind. And so I definitely still was planning to do that. And that took a little time to be able to execute, but now that's still kept in the back of my mind that I still eventually do want to do this. But this definitely was a new challenge for me at the time.
There is the aspect of it where it helps you be excited about work and moving a little bit more in the direction of things that you're excited to do.
Yeah.
Was it also helpful in your search for kind of that finance in New York kind of career that you were really targeting from just like a resume piece perspective?
Yeah, definitely. It certainly was an interesting resume piece. Like there aren't too many people applying to investment banks with a background in aerospace, having worked on these like R&D projects for the next military helicopter. So I think it was a bit of a unique experience that I was able to bring in, and also having that additional degree really helped me stand out. So they helped me certainly set me up for the next phase of my career, and I'm very thankful for that. Not only between the degree I was able to get that saved me thousands of dollars, but I worked with some wonderful people, some managers that really left a lasting impact on me. So I was starting to think about that end game in New York in mind. And having living in Connecticut, working in a manufacturing company, I had no network, no way to be able to just to break into that with what I had, I felt. And so that's where I thought the most effective way for me to be able to move to New York and build a network in New York to be able to get into that industry was to do an MBA. And even though I had the opportunity to do an MBA free of charge, part-time in Connecticut, I decided not to do that, use my savings, basically bet on myself and do a full-time MBA in New York, where I had the opportunity to build a base of people within the finance industry, alumni. They would have events with companies for us to meet people. And also I had the opportunity, MBA program I went into in particular, structured in a way where I was able to do 4 internships during the 2 years. So essentially I had an accelerated semester, do it in half the time, so that the second half of every semester, I was able to do an internship. And so I was able to do 4 internships, 2 of which in financial services, one that the company that ended up hiring me. And so it really ended up working out. And that program was great. It was more management focused, which I really wanted that for a couple of reasons. One is my first manager had an MBA, and he spoke about how that helped him so much in being more well-rounded to become a manager. And it's by developing those soft skills, being an engineer, having this finance master's, very technical degrees. But I felt the MBA, especially in management, would help balance things out, be able to help me build those soft skills too, that I felt like I would need at some point in my career.
That's super interesting to me because I've talked to a lot of folks that have done MBAs, and a huge part of what they highlight is the networking opportunities, right? And it sounds like you very much took advantage of that, and that was one of the big reasons that you decided to go all in on it with your savings and moving and all that kind of stuff. When you talk about the MBA focus on managerial stuff and helping you develop your soft skills there, did that work in tandem with all of the networking that you were doing? What were you getting out of the MBA itself versus the networking that you were doing when you were like constantly interacting with people and shaking hands and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I feel like with an MBA, I didn't learn anything so profound where I just thought I've never heard of that before, but it helps reinforce certain beliefs, empowering your employees, for example, or what are some good traits of managers and things to consider. I think certainly a huge part is the networking aspect of it, is to make sure that you're not just going to class, doing your homework, and that's it. You're there to meet as many people as possible because it's so competitive. The barrier of entry is so high to get into financial services, especially in New York, that you need to be out there, be able to meet people. And it can't just be purely academic. You have to do both, essentially. And they actually helped us with acquiring internships, which is also really great. And I told them I wanted to get into finance. They said, great, the first 2 internships will not be in the financial services industry. We want to give everybody a very well-rounded perspective and look how other industries operate, which I thought was really fascinating approach. For example, the first internship I did was with a large retailer, and it was in the logistics division. It was doing financial planning, but it was just outside of New York, in their distribution center. They had 27 miles worth of conveyor belts in there. And just learning about how they managed their budgeting and their revenue and their forecasting for retail and specific to logistics. I had never seen anything like that before in my career. And so that was very, very different and very unique. And the second internship was in a major telecom company. They were a department that took the customer survey data and they crunched those numbers to see, what different aspects contribute most to overall customer satisfaction. And so that was also very unique and different. You realize that these different industries, they do have some unique aspects. There are some things that are similar across industries, but some things that are very unique that I had never seen before. And so those were very rewarding. And then my third internship, I finally got into finance. It was summer of 2007. I did an internship and it was in the strategy department and I loved it. And actually the manager I had there, she was amazing. And when I was applying for jobs, I was trying to find a way to work with her again because we'd worked so well together. And then my last company was a company I ended up working at. It was in a different role, but it was a major investment bank at the time. And it was more of an internal consulting role, is the way I can best describe it. And so that one I was most excited about because it was really close to what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And so being able to just be in those organizations, even though I was only there for 7-8 weeks at a time, they would give me a project to do. But a lot of it also was just trying to meet people there, trying to understand what do they do, and just trying to figure out my fit for where I should end up in the next phase of my career.
I'm really curious about a couple of different sides of this experience that you went through, the multiple internships. One, what is, to the best of your knowledge or understanding, what is the philosophy behind the MBA program getting you into internships that are outside of the thing that you are targeting?
Mhm.
And from your perspective, as somebody that had an engineering background and went into an industry and then figured out that you wanted to pivot into something else, so you had your push and pull factors there, did you see yourself at any point saying, oh, hey, obviously you had 6 or 7 weeks in each of these roles. Was there any, maybe risk is the wrong word, was there any opportunity for you to rethink what you were actually targeting, finding things that clicked in different ways? As somebody that has switched a lot of jobs, and this whole podcast is focused on career transitions, you exposed yourself to a lot of things, but you stayed on track to the thing that you had been targeting over the last couple of years, moving towards finance. So yeah, anyway, one side of it being, what's the MBA philosophy behind exposing you to all of those different industries? And then the other side of it being like, what do you think kept you motivated to stay on the track that you were targeting?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. The MBA was really unique, and it was a big reason why I chose that MBA. The principles behind it were very unique. It was put together there was a consultant. He was like an industrial statistician and managerial consultant who was really well known in the 1970s and 80s. His name's W. Edwards Deming. And he wrote a couple of books, and he was extremely popular. He still has a very prestigious quality award that's awarded in Japan. And he was actually a big pioneer in helping Japan in their manufacturing. And as he went on and he was focused more on statistics and quality control, he realized more and more that it was management. That's what needed to change. And with a lot of these companies, and he came up with these, in a couple of his books, these principles, these points to good management. And this MBA really centered around his principles. And it was run by one of his colleagues who she worked very closely with for many years. And part of it was you learn that with discipline, these different areas around management that he was very focused on, but also you take it and then you apply it right away in real life. And that's why they would do the internships as well, is take what you've learned and then apply it right away and then move on to the next. So that's how it was going. It was very unique in the way the program was run. And that was a big reason why I ended up deciding to do it.
Gotcha. That's wonderful. And this was at Fordham, is that right?
That's right. This was Fordham University.
And just a quick question is that, were there other programs that you were considering at the time and weighing the trade-offs between this and that?
I was really considering NYU, and I applied, and I was waitlisted at the time there at NYU. They're extremely prestigious. I was really impressed when I attended their open house. Yeah. And thought that they have an amazing network with their alumni and with the financial services industry, and they really help people to move into roles there. Fordham maybe wasn't as high on the rankings, but locally has a great reputation. But I just thought with this specific program can give me the skill set I was really looking for my career.
Love that. And then just to come back to going through these internships, applying what you learned, you understood that was the philosophy of the MBA program. There weren't any moments where you were like, oh, maybe finance is not like necessarily the thing that I want to stay in. I guess that I think you answered my question a little bit. It was kind of like, this was the philosophy of what they were trying to do within the context of you already had this industry you wanted to be in. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And for example, when I was doing my second internship in a telecom company, I built up a really good rapport with my boss who was running that department. And we were he was talking about that he will be looking to hire around the time I was graduating. And if there were chances for me to try to maybe pivot and not do finance overall, but I was really fixated like that. That was my goal. And I didn't really run anything to deter me from that was to get into financial services, try to get into an investment bank in New York. That was my goal all along.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Okay, tell me a little bit about the MBA wrapping up. You had mentioned your final internship that you had was this internal consulting role at a major investment bank. What was the offer like, just in terms of, was it similar to the work that you were doing in the internship?
Well,
Yeah.
I was there in the fall in 2007, and so this was Lehman Brothers. They were at the time the fourth largest investment bank in the U.S. and had been around for a very long time, and really had an amazing culture. And at that time, they were also recruiting at Fordham for a position. It was a 16-month rotation program, and within their capital markets group, and they were looking to hire. They were scouring the country, and they were looking to bring in 8 people into this program. And I applied. I went through multiple rounds of interviews, and very fortunately, I was selected. I was the only one out of Fordham to get the role. The other 7 were from a handful of other prestigious business schools from around the country. And I signed my offer letter December of 2007. And I thought I was so happy and proud. Your 3rd semester in business school, your main focus is interviewing, applying for jobs, interviewing. And a lot of people, they go into their 4th semester still trying to keep applying, keep interviewing. And it's a very stressful time. And the moment you can sign that offer letter, it's a huge relief off your shoulders, I can say. And I was signing it for what I thought was my dream job. I was so impressed with Lehman and their culture and how passionate people were to work there that I was just so excited to start. And that was, my start date was August of 2008.
Wow. Okay. Remind us of the macro picture and timeline for those of us who may not be as...
Sure. So what happened at the time in 2008? So there was a big problem with mortgages. They were called subprime mortgages. Long story short, there was a lot of bad mortgages that were being put into these securities called mortgage-backed securities. And that was starting to unravel in 2008. And the first famous bank that went under was called Bear Stearns. They were at the point of bankruptcy in March of 2008 and got acquired by JP Morgan. Now, they were the 5th largest investment bank at the time in the US. Number 4 was Lehman. So all attention turned to Lehman Brothers. All 4 banks, Goldman, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and Lehman, but the biggest attention was on Lehman. And a lot of the market started to question, would Lehman be the next bank to fall? And that was right around the time I was joining in August of 2000. We were brought in my first day. It was an orientation. There were about 400 of us from all of these post-grad programs from around the world. They flew everybody to their headquarters in New York. We had about a week of training. And of course, it was in the back of all of our minds. Everybody's saying how excited they are to have us to start our journey at Lehman, while at the same time, every time you put on the television or you open up your computer, you hear we're front and center on news, on all attention is on us, basically.
Yeah, that's got to be a stressful place to be. What you had seen as your dream job, you were super excited. What ended up happening during your time there?
Sure.
And how long was your tenure there, I guess is my question.
Sure. So like I said at the very beginning, I started my career in finance in the worst possible place, which was Lehman, and at the worst possible time, August of 2008, because 6 weeks later was when Lehman filed for bankruptcy, which ended up being the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. I had started a couple of weeks in. My first rotation was actually in the real estate group. So I saw all of the holdings of all the assets that everybody was so concerned about, I saw, and that we were helping manage. And the result of that put me in a very unique experience where there was ongoing negotiations to potentially purchase, for other firms to purchase Lehman. And we were helping support those negotiations by providing very detailed data for that. And that the week prior to the bankruptcy, we were working very long hours. And I remember the director of our team brought us into his office late on Friday before the bankruptcy. The bankruptcy got announced Sunday evening in mid-September. That Friday, we were brought in saying we all did everything we could to support the negotiations. There were two firms in-house trying negotiating for the acquisition. They said we did everything we could do. Just, we should hear something within the next day. It'll probably be a similar style acquisition to what happened with Bear. Okay. Saturday, we don't hear anything. Saturday comes and goes. And Sunday morning, we start hearing rumblings saying that Lehman may actually declare bankruptcy Sunday evening before the Tokyo markets open. And we never thought that the word bankruptcy was never brought up at all around me within those walls. I was stunned that Sunday morning that the firm I had just started was going to go bankrupt. And where we didn't think that was going to potentially be an option. And I was living in Midtown, just a couple of minute walk from the headquarters. And after the announcement happened, I got a call from a good friend of mine that I went to business school. He said, "You should go take a walk by your building right now." And this was before Twitter and Facebook was just building up. So you didn't have this instant news feed. So my wife was now my fiance. She had actually just left her job to do her MBA full time. So I was supporting the both of us. And we take a walk, and I'm standing across from Lehman's headquarters on 7th and 49th. And I could see in this first two floors, there's offices, and people were boxing up all their belongings. And you could look this up, and there was a lot of press there taking photos and videos of all this happening. And I was hearing some rumors that day was our badges may not work the next day. And so a lot of people took that as, well, I'm going to box up my things and go home and take them home. And actually one of my own neighbors was a Lehman at the time who did just that. We were talking about that when I first moved into the neighborhood here in Connecticut. And I barely had anything at my desk. I was 6 weeks in. So I thought, I'm going to go in and see what happens. I'm going to go in with an open mind, and I felt like I had nothing to lose. And I walk in and my badge works. Okay, great. We log in, we can't do anything. We're all frozen out of all our computer systems because they had to freeze all the assets. $600 billion worth of assets, a lot of which has to get traded actively on a daily basis, was frozen. Something like this has never happened before. And the whole markets were really teetering at that time because of that. And that's where other firms famously started to need very large amounts of money very quickly. Otherwise, they were going to be going bankrupt. There's a number of very large notable firms that nearly went bankrupt that got acquired or received a large amount of assistance to survive. And
this was like TARP and stuff.
Yep, exactly. So there was a lot of that. And then, so I would come and go my first week, we go in for a few hours, not a whole lot to do. And we knew that there was a firm that was one of the firms that was negotiating beforehand was still negotiating to make the acquisition. And the following week, Barclays had announced that they were acquiring the U.S. operations. And so fortunately, I never missed a paycheck. My badge always worked. And I became an employee of Barclays, who had purchased Lehman Brothers in late September.
That is such a roller coaster. Cool. So yes. Barclays acquires Lehman Brothers.
That's right.
And you're there. Was it a sigh of relief? What was going through your head at the time? And then tell us about what that transition was like to working at Barclays. You were there for quite a few years, obviously. Tell us about how you were feeling and and the transition into working there. Officially.
So I got moved. Really sure how, but I ended up getting moved onto the same floor as this department called risk management, and they didn't really know what to do with me because they dissolved my program, and some of the HR people I was working with had left, and so they're trying to figure out where to place me. And I say, listen, I'll do whatever you need. I'm open. I'm willing to try out and what needs to get done. And coincidentally, a number of people on my floor in risk had left to go to a competing firm, and there was a large amount of openings there. And they said, "What do you think about risk management?" And I said, "Sure, I will give it a try. I'm definitely open for it." Now, the good thing was being in this program, the one silver lining was they preserved us, they shielded us from all the layoffs that were happening afterwards, because you were merging two large banks. There was a lot of redundancies that would lead to layoffs. They purposely tried to keep all of us so that we could stay at the company, and they helped find us roles within the company. So I was very fortunate, because a lot of people lost their jobs in finance, especially when one acquired the other, and a lot of overlaps. I was shielded from that, and I was new to the industry. I had never really known too much about risk management, but this ended up becoming the next phase of my career for the next 11 years across 3 different institutions in New York, was working in risk. It ended up working out well, because after '08, there were a lot of new regulations in the financial services industry that got put into place, a lot of which was around risk management. And so it was a fast growing area. All of major firms were adding in huge amount of resources into building up their risk management platforms, hiring staff. So it was a huge opportunity of growth in the industry at the time.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, so a couple of, are you referring to Dodd-Frank specifically? Were there other things going on at the time? And also, you could give us overview of what risk management means and why that ends up being impacted by these kind of like banking regulations. That would be really helpful, I think, for the audience, just to get some context.
Sure. What ended up why did these major banks fail? The $600 billion assets of Lehman Brothers can collapse so quickly was frankly that these banks were taking very concentrated positions in certain types of securities and with a lot of leverage. And when those securities fell, it started a cascading fallout. And some of that was the risk management of those assets, of that balance sheet. And so Dodd-Frank, you're spot on. That was one of the major pieces of legislation that got passed, along with the Volcker Rule and the Basel Accords, which is internationally drafted, and around making sure that this doesn't happen again. That banks had proper levels of capital, they had better controls around monitoring of risk, and there was much greater scrutiny around that to make sure that if there's another time where the next time there's some kind of crisis that's happening, that the banking sector isn't vulnerable the way it was in '08. And so a lot of new legislation got passed in the next couple of years after 2008. And a lot of that was around risk. So what risk management, there's multiple areas, but the first area I worked in was called market risk. So what that meant was we're holding on to certain securities to facilitate transactions, and price movements, interest rate movements, credit spreads, all these different factors can impact the value of those assets on a given day. And what happens if the value decreases considerably? How much can we potentially lose? And what if we would stress test the portfolios in case of different scenarios, if all of a sudden there is another big recession or a market sell-off, are we prepared for that? And those risk numbers then got translated into capital. So based off of how much risk banks were taking, that would dictate how much capital, how much funds do they need to keep in reserve in case of those events happen, to absorb those losses, to make sure they don't go bankrupt or insolvent the way Lehman did so quickly.
Totally. Thank you for that overview. I'm curious about a couple of different things. One is, I see you were here at Barclays for about 6 years. How did your role evolve over time? Were there promotions? Did you end up being a manager during this time? Tell me a little bit about the track record and history, and then I'll dive in with other questions later.
Okay. Initially, we had gotten absorbed by Barclays, so we were trying to work within the way they operated and within their structure. And so initially a lot of us were shuttling back and forth between the Barclays location at the MetLife building versus the Lehman headquarters, half days between the two until they did the full integration. And so first off, it was around understanding how did they manage risk, what calculations did they use, what's their software platform, and what do they do on a day-to-day. That was for the first, I'd say at least for the first year or two, a big portion of it was development. It was first integrating Lehman and Barclays. And culturally, there were some clashes there.
Hope you enjoyed the conversation so far. We've landed at the spot where things are a little bit more clear and stable for him. We will have a follow-up to this where we get to talk about the progression from finally being in finance, settling into risk management, post subprime mortgage crisis, financial crisis, etc. What I look forward to sharing with you guys when Omar and I re-record is a lot of the stuff that came up a little bit earlier in this conversation about management and what he learned from his early managers and his MBA about what good management is like, what he ended up liking and disliking about being in a managerial role as he made multiple pivots into and out of management IC roles over the course of his career, as well as how the relationship building aspects of management informed his final pivot into wealth management. Super interesting and valuable conversation that Omar is fortunately doing me the kind favor of re-recording, and so really excited to get that back in front of you guys in a couple of weeks when we're able to do that. But in the meantime, hope you enjoyed the conversation so far. Please give me a like, a review, subscribe on YouTube or any of the podcast platforms that you might be finding me on. If you have anything you want to reach out to me at all, slide into my DMs. You can always email me at Varun, that's VARUN, at pushpullpodcast.com. Thank you.